Good morning. I'm Alan Lanham, Dean of Library Services, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here, not only to our building, but to the continuation of the symposium on ancient Greece that we are hosting in conjunction with the College of Business and Applied Sciences. So we're happy to see you here. We want to draw your attention to the program that you picked up at the door. There are various opportunities remaining for you to be involved in this symposium. Today, one of your fellow students will follow this session, and this afternoon there's a session, then tomorrow it's almost all day, and then things continue into next week. So please consult your program for disciplines that you might find allied to what you are interested in, or areas that you might want to become interested in. So this is a good opportunity and a fine way for you to immerse yourself into various disciplines, which I think in a philosophy class you have to do anyway. So make sure that you study the program a little bit after this session, not probably during. But to introduce our speaker, I will ask Dr. Wabi from the School of Technology to do so.
Thank you very much for coming to this session of the Ancient Greece Symposium as a part of a futuristic look into through ancient lenses. That's what we are trying to do with this symposium. Last year we looked into ancient Egypt. No bias here because I'm from Egypt, but we started from Egypt because it's old and ancient. And then the natural progression was to go to Greece and the Hellenistic and this era of theology and history and philosophy and arts and everything. I will introduce our distinguished speaker today with 4 words. The first is philo, second is Sophie, the third is grant, and the fourth, you guessed it, sterling. Philosophy. The first time when I was a child, when I came to know this word, I studied everything and lived in Egypt with Arabic, but philosophy, when I came to know what it means, it just captured my heart and my imagination. To love wisdom, philosophy. I'm sure you study this in your classes and you are expert in this, and we will have and add to it today our love for wisdom through our distinguished speaker. Writing grants is one of the most important activities that many people have to do in their careers to survive and thrive. So writing a successful grant is very important, and I'm not sure if this was intended by the name grant or what, but we have a wonderful, successful grant today. And sterling is the currency of England that was the strongest in the world. And even with metals, they say it is fake or sterling silver. They say, no, it is sterling. So we had it all. We have it all today. Grant sterling.
Thank you, Wafiq. Dean Lanham. When Wafiq asked me to give a talk in this series, at first I was puzzled as to what topic I should choose. The ancient Greeks, that's an enormous topic. Connected with the modern world, that's another enormous topic. So I thought, first of all, I should try to narrow things down. I eventually decided, all right, well, since I do philosophy, I ought to talk about ancient Greek philosophers. Well, that was still a little bit too broad. Several of you are students right now in my ancient Greek philosophy class, and I spend a whole semester talking about ancient Greek philosophy, and I can only scratch the surface in a whole semester, so I couldn't possibly do anything in 1 hour that would be adequate. I can't even do the influence of ancient Greek philosophy on contemporary philosophy, because everything in contemporary philosophy derives from the ancient Greeks, except for a few really bad ideas that the moderns came up with on their own. So that's still too broad of a topic. So I thought, well, why not do ancient Greek philosophers when they are doing what would now be considered science? As many of you know, for the ancient Greeks, there was no distinction between what we call philosophy today and what we call science today. Anyone engaged in the pursuit of knowledge was a philosopher. So I thought, well, it's fair game then for me to talk about ancient Greek science as compared to the modern world. But that's still way too broad. If I were to talk about that topic, I would have to, for example, discuss Aristotle, perhaps the most wide-ranging intellect in the entire history of the world. Aristotle wrote numerous books on meteorology, physics, biology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's way, way too much for one discussion. All right, well then I thought I'll do the so-called Pre-Socratics. The Pre-Socratics are the philosophers who came along before the first sort of intellectual giant of the ancient world, Socrates. So that's why they get called Pre-Socratics. The Pre-Socratics also wrote numerous books about numerous topics, but here at least we have the advantage from the point of view of my topic, or disadvantage from the point of view of knowledge, that almost all of their writings have been lost. All that survives are a few fragments. So I thought if all that survives are a few fragments, surely I can shorten that up to get it into a 1-hour presentation. But I quickly discovered that even just doing the Pre-Socratics and just doing their scientific ideas, that was way too much too. The Pre-Socratics, for example, have long discussions about the principle of conservation of matter. They brought up ideas such as the notion that the Earth was roughly spherical, the idea that the sun and the stars are bodies of burning gases. They were among the first people to attempt to make an accurate map of the known world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that was too much as well. So finally, what I decided on was this. I would talk about a handful of ideas in the pre-Socratic philosophers with regard to physics and biology. Within physics, only sort of general cosmological theories of physics, and so with the topic suitably narrowed, that's what you're going to get today. A very, very short talk on a very, very narrow discussion of a handful of people that you've never heard of. I should note also, by the way, the Pre-Socratics may have even anticipated the so-called many worlds hypothesis of modern physics. I'm not going to talk about that today since it's still up in the air whether we have good reason to suppose that it's true or not. If good reason comes along to suppose that the many worlds hypothesis is correct, I will then give another paper in which I show conclusively that the Pre-Socratics invented it first. On the other hand, if it's discredited, I will give a paper in which I show that the fragments that could be interpreted as suggesting such an idea are clearly mistaken. All right, so a handful of passages on physics and biology. Now, as I've already suggested, our knowledge of the Pre-Socratics is highly limited. All we have, again, are mostly quotations in other people saying, oh yes, Heraclitus believed such and so, or Anaximander said this or that. So giving any talk on the Pre-Socratics involves a certain amount of interpretation. So I acknowledge, to begin with, that what we're doing today is interpretation. I've given you a handout. I hope you all got a copy. The handout contains some of the passages that I'm going to be discussing today. All of these passages have been edited in order to make the point that I wish to make. And I use as my excuse for this the fragmentary nature of the evidence and so on and so on. But I did give you the reference from which the passages are taken, and you're welcome to look them up in that source or in other similar sources and evaluate for yourselves whether or not I have accurately portrayed their ideas. All right, so before I go any further, I should note all of the Pre-Socratics were materialists. All of the Pre-Socratics held that the only things that really exist are physical things. I don't think there are any exceptions to that. There are some philosophers that think that there were rare exceptions, but I think there were no exceptions to that principle. All of the Pre-Socratics were also, at least broadly speaking, empiricists, with the exception of my personal favorite Pre-Socratic, Parmenides. When I say that they were broadly empiricists, I mean that many of them had no sort of conclusive theory of knowledge and its origins, but all of them were concerned to try to come up with scientific hypotheses that would be consistent with our observations of the physical world. Parmenides, as I say, is an exception, since Parmenides argued that our senses are fundamentally mistaken, and that therefore the true nature of reality is utterly and completely different from anything at all that appears to us. But with only that exception, broadly speaking, the Pre-Socratics are empirical philosophers. All right, so on your handout then, let us turn to the first general topic. Under the heading of physics, from the philosopher Heraclitus, the dates here, by the way, are in all cases approximate. Depending on what source you look up, the dates of these various people may be, in fact, substantially different. But I used one particular source that I think is as good as any. So I'm just trying to give you an approximate idea of when these people were around. From the philosopher Heraclitus, we have the idea that all things are in flux. All physical objects, even if they appear to be stationary, are in fact moving. They in fact have small elements that are in imperceptible motion. Nevertheless, even though all things are in a state of change, all events occur due to fixed underlying laws. There are, on Heraclitus' view, what we would today call laws of physics. These laws can be discovered. Heraclitus thinks that the vast majority of human beings are stupid and they have no interest in discovering such things, and so they sort of wander through their lives with no real purpose. But really smart people, like Heraclitus, can discover these laws and can use them to understand the events around them. Again, I have three short passages here, all clipped from longer passages, but I think representative. Heraclitus holds all things are in process or in flux. All things are in motion all the time, even though this escapes our perception. And all things happen according to what he called the logos. So the logos for Heraclitus is the underlying structure of reality. Again, the underlying laws which dictate everything that must occur. The logos is knowable. We are capable of understanding it, even if we see only a fraction of it, and even if, as I suggested, on Heraclitus' view, most people are too dumb to look for any more. So it is this idea which is responsible for many later philosophers and then scientists holding this general principle. Right, that there is, in fact, an underlying explanation for all things that occur, an explanation in the structure of the universe itself, and that it is the duty of intelligent people to try to discover as much of this as they can and pass it on to others. From the philosopher Empedocles, perception occurs through tiny particles that strike our senses. Empedocles held that all physical objects are composed of tiny particles, particles too small for us to directly perceive as they are in those objects. But those particles, when striking our sense organs, give rise to perception. Empedocles held that there are different sorts of particles emitted by different objects. These particles differ in their size and shape and so on. Our sense organs, he thought, contain passages or openings that allow these particles to enter into us and therefore give rise to perception. These passages are of different size and shape, and so only certain particles could enter into certain passages. This is Empedocles' account for why it is, for example, that you can't see sounds. Why can't you see sounds? Well, because the particles that give rise to sound perceptions aren't the right size and shape to fit into your eye. They're the right size and shape to fit into your ears. So you can hear sounds, but you can see colors and shapes and so on. So from Empedocles, then, we get this early account of the nature of perception. This led, that is at least the idea that objects are composed of tiny particles, to the only people on this list that any of you are likely to have ever heard of, Leucippus and Democritus. You've probably never heard of Leucippus and Democritus specifically, but they're known as the Atomists. And they are known as the Atomists because they held that the fundamental structure of reality is atoms. All things that exist are physical, and all physical things are composed of atoms. Atoms, again, are tiny objects, tiny particles, tiny elements of things, too small for us to perceive in themselves. There are different kinds of atoms, and the different kinds of atoms that an object is composed of give rise to the different physical and chemical properties of that object. Right? Metal reacts differently than wood because wood is composed of atoms of different size and shape and weight and so on, and therefore they react differently in different conditions. Again, a passage there. Democritus thinks that atoms are so small as to elude our senses, but they have all sorts of forms and shapes and differences in size. They create by aggregation bulks that are perceptible to sight and the other senses. Right? All things that you can actually see are simply gigantic masses composed of thousands and thousands or millions of atoms. The individual atoms, again, are imperceptible, but once you get enough of them all clumped together, then you have an object. Leucippus and Democritus developed all kinds of theories about how and why it is that atoms clump together and in what combinations they can form and how that produces different sorts of results. They struggled with issues of determinism and free will, since they held that the motions of atoms are dictated by their nature, their physical nature. That includes soul atoms, and yet at the same time, to some degree, they wanted to try to give some sort of account of how humans can have free will, and so they struggled with whether that was possible within the deterministic framework that they themselves had created, and so on. But in any case, it is probably Leucippus originated this doctrine. Democritus was the one who made it famous, who wrote it up, whose books were best known at the time, and therefore he is the one who's often credited with being the inventor of atomism. All right, enough of physics then. Let us turn to biology. I've chosen only a few passages for you from the biological theory of the Pre-Socratics. So first of all, we have Anaximander. Anaximander believed that life came into existence from non-life when a primal soup of some sort was superheated. Terrestrial life, he held, had its origin through descent from fishes, including, as you will see below, human beings. Human beings descended, he held, from other species. So Anaximander of Miletus conceived that there arose from heated water and earth either fish or creatures very like fish. In the beginning, man was born from creatures of another kind. So according to Anaximander's view, the earth originally was a mixture of earth and water, two of the traditional Greek elements. There was no life. Life did not come about as a result of the actions of the gods or anything like that. No, it's simply the case that at some point this earth became heated and heated to such a degree that it spontaneously brought forth the first life. The first life was extremely primitive, small creatures. From those small creatures living in the water, things like modern fish developed, and then ultimately human beings came from such fish. So it is to Anaximander that should go the credit for inventing the idea of the descent of man. Xenophanes. Xenophanes often is not considered a pre-Socratic philosopher. He's often considered simply a poet. Again, just as there's no real distinction among the ancient Greeks between scientists and philosophers, there really is no distinction between philosophers and poets. Xenophanes held that the earth, all current lands were originally covered by sea, that those seas dried up, that the result of the seas drying up are fossil remains of earlier creatures who died and were covered by the mud that resulted as the seas dried. This was a strictly observational discovery. Xenophanes was aware of the existence of fossils in places that were in his time mountainous, and he drew the conclusion that if there are fossils of fish in areas that are now mountainous, then those mountainous areas must at some point in the past have been covered by water, and so this is the account then that he gives. And there's a discussion there of various examples of fossils that he had observed in various regions. I cut the details out so that the handout would fit on a single page, but certainly Xenophanes is aware of these and draws the deduction. Finally, the last philosopher on the list, Empedocles again, the same Empedocles that's up there in the perception section. It is Empedocles that invented the theory of evolution. The theory of evolution, as Darwin conceives it, has two main principles. We need variation in order for evolution to take place, and variation is supplied, on Darwin's view, from random mutation. And then we need some process by which the variation can be weeded out to produce change, and that, of course, is taken care of by natural selection. I did not give you the passages from Empedocles on this subject because there is, in fact, as you can see here, a long string of passages. There are 8 or 9 fragments from Empedocles that deal with different elements of his theory of random mutation and natural selection. They wouldn't all fit on the handout. I gave you the numbers there, again, if you want to look them up in Kirk and Raven, the source that I used. But I will at least give you the broad outline of that idea here. Now, so Empedocles develops this idea of random mutation and natural selection. Now, I must admit, in Empedocles' version of this theory, it's a little bit different from Darwin. Actually, it's quite a lot different from Darwin, which is another reason why I didn't put it on the handout, because if you actually see the passages, then it doesn't look quite as impressive as if I just summarize them. Empedocles believed that the fundamental principle of change in the universe, well, principles of change, were love and strife. Love, Empedocles thought, brings all things together, and strife tears them apart. And the history of the universe, on Empedocles' view, is a cyclical history. That is to say, the universe becomes dominated by love. All things are brought together. Unfortunately, this has the consequence that all things are brought together by smashing them into a tiny ball, which results in the extermination of all life. And then strife begins pulling them apart. Ultimately, strife takes over and has complete control. Unfortunately, this has the result that all things are completely scattered, and so again, there is no life. But during the transitional stages, when the ball of love is being pulled apart, and in the stage in which strife has started to lose the battle again and love is pulling things back together, objects such as the ones that we observe can exist. So there is a cyclical history. Everything smashes together into a ball, pulls out into scattered fragments, smashes back together into a ball, and so on and so on. Now, he held that during the period in which the ball of love has started to be pulled together so that we have physical objects, what happens in the case of life is that various living beings come forward, but they come forward in purely random form. That is to say, you might, for example, have disembodied heads and arms. So strife is pulling the ball apart. It pulls it apart in such a way that organs are created, but those organs unfortunately don't happen to be attached to the other organs. You get things, you get monsters during this period, bodies of humans with heads of animals, and so on and so on and so on. So this is truly a random mutation, a random process by which various combinations of organs are produced. Now, the natural selection part is fairly straightforward. A disembodied arm can't live, so that dies off. Animals with 6 heads don't survive very well. Those die off, and so as time goes by, the malformed combinations of creatures die, and we are left with the species that we observe today. Now, of course, again, this is temporary. The species that exist today can only exist as long as there's a fair equilibrium between love and strife. Once strife takes over completely, then, of course, all of our limbs will be severed, and all life will cease to exist once again. Or perhaps we're going the other direction, and we'll all be smashed together. But in any case, during the transitional phase, Empedocles held, when by random mutation you happen to get the right limbs attached in the right order, the creatures can survive, and then they reproduce. And that accounts for the species that we currently have. So again, it's not exactly Darwin, but it's not altogether so far off either. Now, why did I choose these particular ideas to talk about among the many scientific or quasi-scientific ideas invented by the Pre-Socratics? I chose them because in every case, these ideas were lost. None of these ideas were at least directly the origin of the corresponding ideas in modern science. I entitled my paper that Darwin plagiarized Empedocles, but of course that's not literally true. I'm quite certain that Darwin had never heard of Empedocles or Anaximander and had absolutely no idea of their theories. All of these interesting scientific speculations disappeared. None of them gave rise to an ongoing tradition. This is certainly not true of all the Pre-Socratics. For example, one of the most influential Pre-Socratics was Pythagoras. Pythagoras made numerous contributions to the study of mathematics, Pythagorean theorem, for example. Those contributions were preserved and carried on in the mathematical community by Pythagoras' followers and by others. Other ideas from the ancient Greeks, invented first by the Pre-Socratics, were taken up by Plato or by Aristotle, transmitted from them through the medieval period into the modern period. So why is it then, since some Pre-Socratic ideas were preserved, why were all of these ideas lost? I want to suggest 2 reasons. 2 reasons for the unfortunate demise of the Pre-Socratics. Interestingly enough, neither of these reasons have anything to do with the fragmentary notion of our own awareness of what the Pre-Socratics had to say, because the later Greeks were aware of them. Many of the books of the Pre-Socratics survived to the time of Plato and Aristotle and so on. They were familiar with their ideas. Most of our fragments from the Pre-Socratics, in fact, come from Aristotle, who, as I suggested before, was interested in everything and so liked to record the ideas of other people, even when he disagreed with them. It's actually sort of the other way around. Our knowledge of the Pre-Socratics is fragmentary because their ideas were discarded. It's not that our ideas were discarded because we lost our knowledge of what they had to say. So why were these ideas lost? First of all, ironically, the Pre-Socratic period was, I think, too creative. There were simply too many new ideas being thrown out by various people. I mentioned before that the Pre-Socratics suggested that the Earth is at least roughly spherical. Well, yes, some of them did. But we also have Pre-Socratics who suggest that the Earth is a cylinder, that the Earth is a cube, that the Earth is a flat disk, or that the Earth is sort of a lid-like dome, sort of curved disk, if you will. Each of these ideas had backing from various figures in the Pre-Socratic period, but none of them was considered to be sort of the dominant theory. There was no great pre-Socratic on the level of Plato or Aristotle, where everybody would respect that person's ideas just because they were recognized as the leading intellectual of the period. And so you get all sorts of speculations. Yeah, the atomists said that physical objects are composed of atoms. But other pre-Socratics said that physical objects are entirely solid and can have no parts at all of any kind. Others said that they are made of a kind of seed. Others says they are built of the Greek elements. Some pre-Socratics holding that all objects are ultimately composed of water. Some holding that they are ultimately composed of air. Some ultimately composed of fire. Interestingly enough, the Greek element of earth gets no backer. None of the pre-Socratics said that every physical object is composed of earth for some strange reason. Sure, Empedocles may say that species arose by love and strife, but other people said that they were created by the gods or descended from the gods, or that they spun off out of a cosmic sphere that was rotating, or any of a number of other hypotheses. So one problem with transmitting the ideas that I selected for you on the handout is that they are, in fact, selected. Pre-Socratics were coming up with ideas about just about every topic in an amazing variety for a relatively short period of time that begins with Thales in roughly 625 BC and ends with Socrates in roughly 470, so a period of only about 150 years. So that's one reason. So many new ideas were being thrown out that nobody knew which ones to hold on to and which ones to discard. Right? They couldn't sort them out and fix on any of them, and as a result, they all came to be equally discarded. The second reason, connected with the first, the ancient Greeks, though they engaged in scientific speculation, did not have the idea of experimental testing. That's not quite right either. They did have the idea of experimental testing, but there was no sort of organized, cohesive body of science. That is, there were no process by which it was expected that the ideas of one pre-Socratic would be tested or checked out by somebody else and then integrated into some whole. And they did not generally use their experimental methods when they had them on their sort of grand speculative theories. They tested specific ideas. They tested, for example, whether you could tell the distance of a ship out to sea by using various triangulation techniques and so on. They tried it out and found out that it worked. So it's not that they were completely ignorant of the idea that your theories could be tested. It's just that they didn't apply them to the big theories like this. No one ever thought to say, well, let's see, what evidence could we gather to try to figure out whether there really were disjointed limbs that then, by natural selection were weeded out into the current species. This, I suggest, is the reason that although all sorts of interesting ideas that later become part of modern science were thrown out by various pre-Socratics, by and large, this is not the result of transmission from the ancient Greeks to the modern world. Again, I've selected some ideas that weren't transmitted for the purposes of this talk. Again, in mathematics and in other fields, they were. So there's my conclusion. The pre-Socratics were too clever and not clever enough. Too clever in that they came up with far too many ideas for all of them to be true and all of them to be held on to and all of them to be transmitted, and not clever enough to figure out a way to sort them out into the ones that were truly worthy and the ones that were not. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Grant. That was a successful Sterling Grant. That was really... Any questions? I have a couple, but I wouldn't start until somebody would start for me, please. Any questions? I see many eyes talking. Yes, I see eyes talking.
Uh, uh, you mentioned the observation, I guess it was Empedocles or Xenophanes, that fossils were found high in the mountains and fossils of sea creatures. Uh, to what extent do we have any idea that this observation could have given rise to the idea of a worldwide flood and Noah's Ark and so on?
Yeah, not in the Pre-Socratics. There's certainly speculation that in various cultures that other people made similar observations. I mean, Xenophanes is reporting observations that he is aware of. He wasn't, sort of an explorer that, said, "Wow, look, I've come upon these things that no one else has seen." He's reporting things perhaps he has seen, but not things that he claims to have discovered. So certainly there was an awareness among the intellectual community of the early Greeks that such things were out there. Xenophanes is the only recorded instance among the ancient Greeks of somebody who tries to draw deductions from that, right? Who says, "Wow, this is interesting. How could this have happened?" His hypothesis, of course, is not a flood, but a sort of universal period in which land was covered by earth. And then he mixes that in with some much more complicated ideas about how earth ultimately absorbs water and all this other stuff. But at least among the Pre-Socratics and the Greeks, these are the only records we have of somebody trying to explain how this could occur. But there's good reason to suppose that other cultures were aware of fossil remnants in areas that were then covered by land. And so it's no, that were covered by land at the time, but fossil remnants of sea creatures. So it's quite possible that there is some connection. But again, it wasn't drawn. That connection wasn't drawn by the ancient Greeks.
How old is the idea of Noah's Ark?
I don't know. I know that there's some controversy over the exact, but similar ideas exist in the Babylonians, for example, long before this period. Sumerians, I think. I know the Babylonians for sure had a similar idea, but I think the Sumerians too. So it's a very old idea.
And I hear about Chinese version of this also, so it has been disseminated one way or another. Some people take this as positive or negative regarding the biblical story. For example, you see that some people who are against the Bible would say, hey, in every culture they have this flood, this thing, in a modification or adaptation. Those who are the theologian or Bible would say, okay, it was a story that started with the patriarch, and when people went, everybody got his own story version. So it confirms that it happened, but so you can look both ways. Another question. I'm intrigued with the idea of the atom thing. I mean, and back then, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 back then, however, how many thousands, they come up with the idea of small things without a microscope or something. How, with your 21st century, I look into the idea that starts over there. Now we look to the atomic theory and atomic bomb and so forth, and we can say, okay, that's. But for these people to start from scratch and say that there are some small things that we can't see by eyes.
Yeah, in the handout, I think I mentioned the passages that I give are from Leucippus and Democritus because they're known as the Atomists, and so it's sort of their theory, and so I thought, well, I ought to give them credit for it. But yes, yeah, they coined the name atoms for these particles. But as I mentioned, you can find a prior version of that view in Empedocles and in other Pre-Socratics as well. So what they're trying to do, the earliest Pre-Socratics tried to give an account of the nature of the physical world in terms of the four Greek elements, right? Air, earth, fire, and water. Again, earth for some reason doesn't have an advocate, but the others all do. It's Parmenides, the anti-empiricist, who comes along and argues on philosophical grounds that the universe can't really be composed of these sorts of things. It can't really be air, earth, fire, and water. And then Zeno, his famous pupil, defends this by means of various paradoxes and tries to say, well, if you try to believe in motion and change and objects having parts and multiple things and so on, you're led into these impossible contradictions. And so you ought to simply abandon your belief in these things and admit that our perceptions are just fundamentally wrong. And the universe is one single entity, unchanging, no time, no space, and so on and so on. There's a reaction against Parmenides. Nobody thinks Parmenides is right among the Pre-Socratics that follow him, other than Zeno. But at the same time, they were uncomfortable with the idea of the kind of philosophy that had gone on before Parmenides. In other words, they sort of thought Parmenides had offered them a challenge, and they couldn't go back to the way things were before Parmenides, but they didn't want to accept that there's no time and so on. And so it was in the process of struggling to come up with an account of this that they started to develop their theories. So, for example, Empedocles and Anaxagoras were both influenced by Parmenides' idea that there couldn't be change. Well, they rejected the notion that there couldn't be change, but they did accept the notion that change couldn't take place between substances. In other words, they thought, well, Earth can't really change into air, for example, or water. And so that gave them a problem because there are instances where it appears that things change into other substances. And so they tried to account for this by arguing that, well, objects are really composed of parts of different kinds of things. So I didn't include this, for example, but we have an attempt to account for how it is that when you eat something, it nourishes your body. Because how is it that if I eat bread, it can turn into skin and bones and so on? That requires the transformation of the bread into something else. And, well, they weren't comfortable with that idea. So they hypothesized, well, the bread must really have little bits of flesh and bone in it. But they obviously must be so small that we can't see them. And so then when we eat the bread, our body processes it by extracting the flesh and bone and attaching it to our body and then getting rid of the rest of it. Well, again, that requires the notion that there are, within the objects we perceive, tiny little particles of other kinds that we can't perceive. And this ultimately led to them to postulate the Anaxagoras is not on your list, but Anaxagoras holds that there are little seeds, he calls them, of every kind of thing. So there are iron seeds and wood seeds and flesh seeds and so on and so on. And all of these seeds are too small to perceive. And physical objects are determined by whatever seed predominates. Okay, so this looks like wood and reacts like wood because it's mostly wood seeds, but there are all kinds of other seeds as well. And so then it's the atomists who essentially take these ideas, call these things atoms, and start trying to put together a theory, a purely physical theory of how they interact with one another and how they compose the objects we perceive and so on.
It was interesting also for me to hear that the explanation, excuse me, for not seeing the sound, because the particles or atoms can be seen, quote unquote, by our ears while we can see them by our eyes. So it's kind of interesting way out of.
Yeah, and that's an idea, by the way, in Empedocles that is certainly still known in later period. Plato, for example, makes reference to it in one of his dialogues. Well, of course Empedocles' theory of effluvia. And so in the conversation, it appears that, well, obviously any educated Greek would at least know of this theory, whether they agreed with it or not. So apparently that theory of perception was well known enough that it could be taken for granted in a conversation that other people would be familiar with it.
I think we have a couple of minutes for other couple questions, if you like. Anybody question? The microphone is not for the sound in as much it is for taping. So if you like, I was kind of. You have another question? Thanks.
I don't want to jump in front of you, Joaquin. Just to comment on the senses and the shapes and sizes of particles. Geometry played such a big role for the Greeks, and at least starting with Pythagoras. I think from my reading, the discovery that there was a very small number of regular polyhedrons was striking, and I think it carries down through the Greeks. I may be wrong, but I think 5 regular solids, the sphere with one side and the cube with 6 sides, for example. And I think, 5 senses, 5 regular solids, then perhaps they put them together that way. So you've got one shape that only goes in the ear. Feel free to comment on that.
Yeah, I don't know. What we have, oddly, apparently, as I said before, the theory was widely known. Even it wasn't necessarily held by everybody, but it was widely enough known, as I say, that Socrates in a conversation could assume that the person that he's talking to would be aware of it. But what we have of the theory now is extremely fragmentary. We only have, I think, 2 passages that even refer to this theory, and neither passage says very much about it other than that there are different passages in the senses and different effluvia, he calls them, that strike us. So it's not known. According to one of the passages, it specifically says this is true for all of the senses. I'm not sure that Empedocles actually held that it was true in the case of touch, since perhaps I should have said all of the ancient Greeks hold a view held by at least many modern physicists that there's no such thing as action at a distance. All cause and effect must occur by contact. And so that's why Empedocles had to have something physically traveling from the object to your sense organ in order for sensation to take place. But of course, in the case of touch, we don't need that. Right? We don't need something flying off the object hitting my sense organ since I'm directly in contact with it. So I'm not sure whether Empedocles thought that touch actually functions in that way. But it's possible that he did, because he might very well have held that we can only have sensory perceptions if the object that we're touching has the right form. So it may be that even there, although we don't have things flying off the object, it may be that the object has to be composed in the right shape for us to feel it.
Any other questions or comments? Yes. Would you say your name?
My name's Bill. I was just wondering if, Dr. Sterling, do any of these ideas go back farther than the ancient Greeks? Are they influenced by any other people? Especially like these that were on the list.
There are no cases where we can trace their origin beyond, in some cases, as I just suggested, earlier Pre-Socratics. So again, the Atomists, you can find at least the root of their theory in Empedocles and Anaximander and so on. But there's no case at least with regard to any of the sort of major theories that I've been discussing here, where we can say with any good reason, so and so got this idea from somebody outside the tradition of the Pre-Socratics. It's certainly not the case as far as Greek thought altogether. Athens, for example, is a major port city, and so there was contact with the Phoenicians, and through the Phoenicians, contact with Egypt and possibly India and lots of other places as well. So it's not that the Greeks were unaware of the world beyond them, but as best we can tell, by and large at least, their speculation is internal to the tradition. That's why Thales, the first pre-Socratic, is sometimes considered to be the first philosopher.
Any other questions, comments? I I have an observation or question without taking sides or creating any enemies, just scientifically looking at things. Just take yourself outside. Why is it over the history, it was more appealing to the human mind that things started by itself, magically, quote unquote, by itself, and we ended up with this sophistication and design that we see everywhere. More than that there's a person, be it God of the Bible or whatever, creator, somebody who did that intentionally and designed it. Why is it more appealing to be random and natural selection rather than somebody who really organized it this way?
Yeah, for the ancient Greeks, for whatever reason, none of the ancient Greeks suggest that the physical universe was created. But most of them thought that the physical universe was formed by the gods. In a way, Empedocles' theory and some of the other Pre-Socratics are actually swimming upstream as far as Greek thought as a whole is concerned. So the idea of a creator, again, is foreign to the Greeks by and large. The idea, though, that matter is sort of, formless, chaotic, disorganized stuff, and that if you're going to make anything of it, you have to do something, right? You have to have some intelligent force putting it that way. That idea actually is the dominant one among the ancient Greeks. Not the only one, but at least the dominant theory that the gods look upon, formless or chaotic matter, and gods or the Titans sometimes, and they think, well, we got to make something out of this, and so the world as we perceive it is a result of divine activity, but not originally creative activity so much as formative activity.
Well, I see our time is running, and I assume and gather that all of you are philosophers because you love philosophy. And thank you very much for coming. If you have any other questions, I take your permission. Send
Yes,
him
yes.
emails or email me.
Yeah, by all means.
Thank you. See you.